Welcome, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us on our Responding Efficiently to Major Data Breaches Within the Government, sponsored by Nuix webinar. Just wanted to very quickly talk about the overall focus of this webinar, is that the federal government needs to be prepared for incidents to happen. And in preparing, it will reduce costs. But in addition, we will be able to demonstrate today and show how we were able to appropriately instrument and collect data to detect incidents, reduce the dwell time, but more importantly, be able to notify people when their critical value data has been compromised. Prior to beginning the webinar, I'd like to introduce my co-speakers. First of all, I'd like to introduce Harlan Carvey. Harlan.
Hi, I'm Harlan Carvey. I'm the Director of Intelligence Integration at Nuix. I've spent the past 20 years performing digital forensics and incident response activities, mostly in the private sector. For the last decade or so, I've been directly involved in incident response with respect to dedicated persistent adversaries, as well as engaged in threat hunting. I joined Nuix because the security intelligence products we offer are force multipliers and force enablers for our clients.
Thank you, Harlan. I'd also like to introduce Hoke Smith. Hoke.
Hi, everyone. This is Hoke Smith. I'm a regional director at Nuix. I focused on our cybersecurity and investigation solutions. And I came to Nuix after about 10 years managing projects in the intelligence community related primarily to insider threat and big data analytics. I'm happy to be on the call today.
Thank you, Hoke. And I'm Keith Lowry. I have over 30 years experience in managing and directing and creating policies in the government, supporting insider threat, counterintelligence, and human intelligence collection activities. Prior to that, I was also a cyber crime police officer and detective out in Silicon Valley. Well, let's get started with our presentation. You know, it's interesting that federal agencies continue to be breached. And the need to promptly notify those whose data has been compromised is paramount. When you look at some of the most recent, within the past few years, activities that have occurred, OPM comes to mind, but then also Yahoo and Equifax. They're all examples of what I call poor notification. We can learn from this. There are many breaches within the government also that are not mentioned here, but we have some of them listed up on the screen. And I know that notifications are frequently delayed due to lack of planning and sometimes by fiat from those in charge. I can distinctly recall a specific example within the government where the legal department just said, you know, we haven't reached the notification threshold yet. And we all were left scratching our heads wondering what that notification threshold was. And so today what we'd like to do is discuss ways to lessen the impacts of breaches and methods to improve notification when critical value data is at risk. In our opinion here at Nuix, this is all about the endpoint. That's where it begins. And that's because that's where most of the adversaries begin their breach activities. Hoke, do you have anything to add on that?
Just a couple of thoughts. So for one thing, everybody can see that there's an SEC logo on here. The SEC experienced a breach actually last year, but it's come out in the press this year. There's been some press reporting around it, some hearings on the Hill around it. And one of the things that the SEC commissioner has stated publicly is the importance of early notification. And he is speaking less about his own agency and more about the commercial enterprises that the SEC is responsible for regulating. So there definitely seems to be more and more focus on the importance of early notification, and certainly Equifax is an example of, I think everyone would agree, of how not to handle it. The other point I wanted to make around protecting the endpoint. So there's some data out there supporting why Nuix is focused on the endpoint specifically. The Verizon's latest data breach investigations report found that the two assets most commonly attacked were servers and user devices. And another just data point is that Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 1000 companies are beginning to see this endpoint gap. And so a recent survey by Optiv found that most of those enterprises have endpoint strategies or strategy roadmaps in place that include endpoint refresh initiatives. So this is a topic and an area and a point of vulnerability that more and more people are looking at.
Thank you, Hoke. So what we're trying to do here is really get everybody to focus on the goals of what we should be trying to achieve. And the first thing that we need to try to achieve is to be able to shorten the time between when an event occurs or attempts to occur and the detection of that event. And it's the second point is we're all trying to figure out how to lengthen the time between the various events occurring. Quite frequently, we're so overwhelmed with data that's coming in, it's extremely difficult to cull through that data and to be able to say, this is an event that we need to concentrate on. And we also believe then that when you learn from your threats and understand what their tactics, techniques, and procedures are that are being used, then you as an agency can maximize your opportunity to detect them and prevent them from being successful in their breach activity. And thirdly, it's important that we all realize we need to maximize the options for actions that can be taken. Too often, agencies focus solely on a law enforcement action. The problem with that is that there are many other things that could be taken, such as administrative actions or mitigation actions, or even taking internal discipline that have nothing to do with litigation or law enforcement. But we need to come up with programs that will support all of those functions and all of those outcomes. And we think that the way to do that is by three separate bullets. And the first one is safeguarding the data. And we mean by that visibility into the data. Being able to rapidly understand where your data resides, being able to know who has access to it and what they did with it after they accessed it is an important key to this. The second thing is rapidly investigate and respond, and I know that we're all trying our best to do that. And the last is notifying promptly. That's the one thing that we all seem to be falling short on, is what is the notification gate? What is the process by which we go through and notify an individual when their data is compromised or has been attacked? And the basis for achieving this goal, we believe, is the endpoint monitoring by a trained and dedicated staff who significantly reduce the dwell time of an adversary. And for those that aren't aware, the dwell time is the time between when the initial breach or infrastructure perimeter and the adversary being detected. We think that we have the ability to achieve that through some of our activities, and I'm going to turn it over to Harlan because he has the next slide. Harlan.
As stated in the title of this slide, preparation is the key. Incidents and breaches are going to happen. The message from information security professionals over the past 2 to 3 decades has been that breaches are in fact a certainty. In fact, one of the comments I've heard at many conferences is that if you don't know that you've been subject to a breach, you probably already have. As such, taking a proactive approach must be considered a best practice business process. Breach preparation includes instrumenting the endpoints to provide the necessary level of visibility into an adversary's activities. This level of visibility leads directly to an earlier notification of a breach, to the point where the adversary is detected before they are able to access the sensitive information or the critical value data that you possess. Early detection means that incident response activities will be effective at stopping the adversary, rather than attempting to guess what occurred after the fact. Costs associated with breach preparation can be planned for and programmed into a budgeting cycle, whereas costs associated with a breach are unforeseen and significantly higher. Overall, breach preparation is prudent from a business and fiscal responsibility perspective. Keith?
Thank you, Harlan. And just let me take a moment and talk about a little term that we use frequently, which is left of breach and right of breach. And as this slide depicts, what we're talking about by left of breach are those things that Harlan just spoke about, which are things that you can do to prepare for the inevitable when it occurs. Right of breach refers to those things that are going to happen after the breach occurs, and the longer it takes to notify and discover, in our estimation, the greater the complexity of those things that are going to occur right of breach. And that's why we mean early detection means less impact, and the faster notification means that you have less work to do, because as we've all seen, the internal investigation leading by news cycles, leading by public issues, and then congressional hearings are what really are the devastating effect it has. Not to mention, when somebody has their data taken, the impact on their personal lives. And so the essence of this is each agency needs to develop realistic expectations of what it is that they're able to accomplish. And then once you've decided what those realistic expectations are, then establishing the policies that support those expectations and conducting exercises and red teams and tabletops to go through the steps that's going to have to occur, because the eventuality is going to happen. You just need to be prepared for it. And that brings us to the next slide, which is to notify or not to notify. And the hard part about this is that there are so many different policies and instructions and guidelines and executive orders and codes that are out there that it's difficult to navigate through all of these different things, but it really begins with the agency itself. The agency needs to decide what is the policy that we're going to follow, and then make sure that it's in compliance with the other policies. But then prompt notification has got to be the end goal for that. Each agency is held to a vague standard because there are so many different ways and instructions out there. Every agency kind of stumbles through this, and it's better to understand it as more than just an IT problem. It is the entire agency that needs to be involved. So these are some steps we're going to go through in the next few slides that tell you how to improve your response. It's going to reference both on the right hand of the breach and on the left hand of the breach. And just as a way of an example, I know that probably some of the people who are listening were affected by the OPM breach. Well, so was I. And what I was really astonished to experience with that was how long it took before I was formally notified that I was a part of that breach. But in addition to just how long it took, the number of notifications that I received as if they were unaware that they'd sent me previous notifications. The whole system made me ponder and wonder exactly what was the policy that they're trying to go forth, and what were the reasonable expectations. Harlan, I think you have a couple of additional comments on this.
Yeah, I do, Keith. I think it's important to point out that with respect to the OPM breach, that breach was actually discovered nearly a year after the personal information of 21 million Americans was accessed. Some reports indicated that the breach was discovered when a consulting firm named SciTech Services was demonstrating a network monitoring appliance on the OPM infrastructure. But there's a FedScoop website article that states that a contract employee had actually discovered indications of the breach 5 to 6 days prior to the SciTech demo. So the OPM breach was not discovered and not detected as the result of monitoring by the organization itself. Regardless, the breach was detected nearly a full year after sensitive data was accessed. I'm reinforcing that point because that's a very important piece of information that needs to be understood with that particular breach, rather than the breach being detected prior to the adversary accessing the sensitive data and the adversary being prevented from accessing that data. Due to the nature of the data that government organizations store, maintain, and process, that information must be adequately protected from unauthorized access and exposure. Should that data be accessed or exposed, there are a variety of notification requirements and even laws that must be understood and followed. Again, that's to Keith's point from the previous slide. Further, a dearth of instrumentation makes it impossible to determine what information was accessed. In such cases, notification may have to be based on all available records. So in short, if you cannot explicitly identify those records that were accessed, you may need to notify on all available records. As such, endpoint visibility will not only illuminate the data that the adversary was attempting to access, but more importantly, provide a means of early warning, allowing for the adversary to be detected and stopped prior to accessing that sensitive data. Instrumentation of the endpoints provides critical visibility. This visibility leads to faster detection, more complete information associated with the incident or the breach, and then therefore leads to a faster, more efficient, more complete breach response before a dedicated adversary can access sensitive information or critical value data. Instrumentation, visibility, response should be your mantra. The clock is ticking.
And if I can, I would just like to add one comment to that, Harlan, which is that we can achieve this critical path that Harlan just described. And that's what we would like to continue talking about today, which is how to further improve the response based on these kind of broad things that we've been talking about. And to further improve that, basically, the question is, where's your critical data? As an agency, are you able to identify where you believe your critical data resides? And it's interesting to note here, and Harlan and I have talked about this offline in other venues, that quite frequently the data that you think is critical value data is not necessarily valued as critical by adversaries. And sometimes the opposite is also true. A lot of times data that you think is utterly unimportant is critical value data to adversaries. And it's always surprising to learn when that kind of incident occurs, the recognition that pops into people's minds, say, oh yes, we should have thought of that. The second thing is you have to understand the data. We have to perform scans to find out where the storages are located, understand that it might violate security policies. But until you know where your data is and what it is, you can't answer those questions. The last thing is you have to remediate the policy and instead establish the systems and processes that allow you as an organization to protect those pieces of data wherever they may reside. Hoke, I believe you have a comment on this as well.
Oh, I just wanted to add, so in working with defense customers and healthcare customers, what we're seeing is that even after that critical value data is identified in the initial stages, that these regulated enterprises want to have visibility into modifications and changes to that data. So as an example, for PHI in a healthcare organization, they want to know, where it is today, but they want to be able to follow it when it migrates to a user's workstation or to a laptop that's off-site. And they may also want to know when it changes. And that's something that's possible with current endpoint technologies, and we'll talk more about that later. But that is something that we're seeing more of, is this desire to not just know at a single point in time what's going on with sensitive value data, but to be able to keep tabs on it over time.
Thank you, Hoke. So that kind of leads us into our slide. What is it we're talking about when we say the endpoint or early detection of breaches can prevent loss of data and exfiltration. And how do we gain that visibility to allow for prevention? And basically, as Harlan and Hoke have said, and this is what Nuix has also come to believe vehemently, is that early detection comes from monitoring and detection of breaches. And as Harlan said, OPM breach was discovered by accident. It was discovered by a vendor doing a network monitoring appliance or showing a network appliance. Can we as agencies within the government rely upon accidentally being able to find out who has gained access to our systems? And part of what we've done here is that Nuix, from the beginning, has created the next generation of tools that will improve your agency's ability to no longer be surprised or to have to be told by a vendor that you're being breached. And Hoke is going to go through and walk through this explanation of our incident lifecycle. Hoke.
All right, yeah, so as Keith mentioned, you could think of incidents as proceeding along a life cycle similar to this one. This is, of course, a very simplified view of the kinds of things that are going to occur in the course of a breach or an insider threat or any other kind of security or risk-related incident, beginning with the idea of preventing it or protecting the enterprise from a threat, including the concept in our model of deflection, which basically means hardening your enterprise such that the adversary chooses a different target other than you, but also using protective capabilities to protect your critical value data, to protect yourself against various kinds of threats that may come from the outside or for the inside. After protection, we have detection, of course, which is just detecting and finding things that are going on inside the enterprise. Once you've detected something, in many cases, a deeper collection of material will be necessary. So, for example, if I've detected potentially suspicious behavior on a particular endpoint, my next step typically in many digital forensics workflows is to go and collect a full disk image of that affected host. Investigation is doing something with whatever I've done in the collection. And then litigation, of course, sometimes can happen at the end of this process of investigation. Now, Nuix solutions are lined up beneath this. Most, if you've heard of Nuix, you've probably heard of us through our eDiscovery product there in the bottom right. Investigator Workbench is also based on that same Nuix engine technology and is a very powerful tool for investigating all kinds of files, such as full forensic images or shared drives or email archives or almost any type of file you can imagine is able to be investigated, or we can investigate with Investigator Workbench. Enterprise Collector is used to collect data. And then Adaptive Security is the solution that we're going to demonstrate today. And as you can see, Adaptive Security provides capabilities across the first 4 phases of this, all the way up into litigation, starting with deflection and protection, moving through into being able to actually detect malicious behavior across the enterprise, to collect some level of detail about that information, and then to actually conduct an investigation. Adaptive Security is really addressed or designed to address 2 fundamental shortcomings that we've seen in security. First and foremost is visibility, and we've talked a little bit about that already in the webinar, which is just the need to see what's going on the most important assets in the enterprise, on servers, laptops, PCs. Adaptive Security gives the security folks much more ability to see what's going on in those assets than they've had in the past. And the second need that we see is for greater agility and responsiveness. And that simply reflects the fact that the threat environment is changing so quickly that any solution that is crafted to address the most current ransomware or the most current metasploit attack is ultimately going to fall by the wayside as attack tactics evolve. So what we've done with Adaptive Security is create a platform that provides a high degree of customizability, configurability, to the point where security can change what it wants to detect, what it wants to alert on, what it wants to prevent on the fly. And that's the way that we're driving increased agility for security practitioners with adaptive security. So we've got a couple of demo use cases here, and why don't I switch over to that, and we'll pull those up.
Okay, Nan, while Hoke is pulling those demonstrations up, I just wanted to tell you that Nuix decided about 3 years ago to get into the adaptive security and cybersecurity lifecycle by not purchasing some off-the-shelf or something that already existed, but to design and create what we believe is the next generation of cybersecurity tools and methodologies. And what Hoke is about to show you is the culmination of bringing some of the best and brightest throughout the different experiences in cybersecurity to Nuix, specifically to design these products. I'll turn it over to Hoke now.
Oh, cool. So as Keith mentioned, this is our next generation approach to endpoint detection and response. There are two key capabilities in it. One is a digital behavior recorder, which you could think of like a video camera or an MRI on the endpoint, and that is collecting data and streaming it back to a server. We're looking at that server data here through our enterprise console. The second key component to the technology is something we call the logic engine. And the logic engine automatically responds to threats with actions like alerting, blocking, and network isolation on the host. So it is putting logic and intelligence out on endpoints and responding to threats as they're encountered or as they're experienced on the outer edges of the perimeter. So we have two demo use cases today that relate to breach prevention. The first example is around actually, stopping a breach from happening. So of course, hopefully you don't end up in the position where you have to go through the breach notification process. Most large enterprises who have sensitive customer data probably will end up doing that at some point, but that doesn't mean to give up on certainly reducing the number of times that happens. And that's really the first part of our strategy with adaptive security, is to prevent breaches. And so to get very practical and tactical, what you all are looking at here is a set of alerts in our alerts pane up here next to the 16 number, and that indicates that I have 16 active alerts right now. You can see under state that they're active and pending investigation. I've already assigned them to me by just assigning, going through and assigning in our workflow engine here. So I've got alerts here, I've got endpoints here. At the moment, this is a demo laptop where we've got one Windows 7 machine feeding in data. For the purposes of demonstration, we've run some other data into our database here, and that's what we'll work through as our incident triage. But the first example and the first use case is an example of a blocking action. Now, this is an illustration of how adaptive security uses runtime behavior analysis on the endpoint to observe what's each piece of code as it attempts to execute, and decides whether or not to block that based on potentially malicious characteristics or behavior. So in this case, what we have is a process that's tainted. In other words, it's something that we suspect is relevant in a spear phishing attack, and Outlook was the process in this case. And we see that this process was starting up with an invalid signature. So that's a simple example of the kind of automated blocking that we can do with a programmable logic engine out on the endpoint. So in this case, what this is telling me is that a process was started up by WinZip. It was obviously packed and zipped up, and that we blocked that process because it violated a behavior rule. So that is the first illustration that we wanted to show, which is just the ability to protect and to defend an endpoint based on behavior analysis at runtime. Now, the second demo use case, we'll actually go into this threat, and what we'll do is we'll show how you would actually go through an incident triage in adaptive security. So this is an on-the-fly investigation of a piece of malware. This and what we're trying to get across with this is that if there was a breach and your enterprise disclosed that, as soon as you disclose it, you're quickly going to have to answer a whole bunch of follow-on questions. How many systems were affected? Which systems specifically were they? What data was affected? What user credentials were involved? How did the attacker get in? And those are all the kinds of questions that you can answer with the really rich data that the digital behavior recorder and adaptive security collects from endpoints. Now, that's kind of a hard thing to illustrate. So what we do is we'll just run a piece of malware. In this case, we're going to use a remote access Trojan that was developed by an advanced persistent threat actor. We'll run that, and that's the alert that we have here, is indicating that this actually ran. It violated my phishing rule, but I had configured my logic engine on this endpoint to alert rather than block. So that's my starting point into incident triage. Now, if I wanted to take immediate action based on this, I can go down to my endpoint here, and I can actually network isolate this. And that's as easy as clicking Enable Network Isolation. Adaptive Security will tell me that that's pending, and then it will execute that job and isolate this host from the network. Now, at this point, G4L17 is no longer able to talk out to the internet. I can still communicate with it here from my server, but other than that, it is isolated from the internet. So I'm going to re-enable its ability to talk, because I don't want to leave it in an isolated state. And then we'll go over and jump into an investigation. So hopefully that was clear what I just did there, which was to say, okay, this looks like a serious threat. I'm going to protect this endpoint immediately. What we'll proceed from here is to dive deep into Afghan Air Force.scr, which is my suspicious or potentially malicious process. Now, to do that, we will use the digital behavior data that I mentioned, and that's all captured here. There's 13 different categories of digital behaviors that the endpoint code is capturing and sending back to the server, and you can see them all here. And they encompass things like user sessions, logins, logouts, all the processes that are starting up, and a number of others that we'll go through. To open one of these up, I just click Processes and then set a time span, and I get all of my process stops and starts during this period of time. So in this case, I've got a couple hours of process data sitting here in front of me. Now, for each process, we're capturing all of the kinds of data that you would need to review it for potential malicious use. And that's going to, of course, encompass the process name, the path that it ran from, the parent process that launched it, the command line that was used to launch it. And we're also going to create an MD5 hash. We're going to hash all of these processes, which becomes relevant as we dig into this and as we start to use threat intelligence to try to determine what's suspicious and what's not. So what I've done here is I've pre-populated these same grids with data that is relevant to this little investigation. I've filtered it down. So in my first example here, what I've done is I've filtered this to an hour, within an hour of the alert that we received that Afghan Air Force ran on G4L17, okay? And my filter editor just says, okay, show me where process name is Afghan Air Force or parent name is Afghan Air Force. And it was a process start. And that's really the beginning of an incident triage as we envision it in this product, which is we're going to start by digging into the process. We're going to focus on the process and learn as much as we can about it. And in doing that, we'll assemble a process tree, starting with whatever parent originated this and working down to all of the child processes that started up on the affected host. In this case, what I can see just by searching for Afghan Air Force as the process or as the parent is I've immediately got a new piece of information here, which is that this Afghan Air Force process started up another one, usha.exe. So what I'll do is quickly expand my search out and say, did that process in itself also start up anything? And so I'll say, I'll add that to my set of operators here and ask for any time in which USHA was a parent process. And what that's going to reveal is that USHA actually started up a service host. And service host, of course, is a known good process in Windows. This is an example of it being corrupted and used to do various nefarious things on the host. And this is revealed to me in the process grid here. I can see that USHA started up SVC host under PID 2808. So my next look might be to go a bit deeper and say, okay, did the malicious version of service host in turn start up any other process? And so I'll search for that. There's no other processes started up by this particular guy here. So what this is telling me is that for this time frame, this is the process tree that I need to be concerned with. WinZip started Afghan Air Force. Afghan Air Force started USHA. USHA started up service host. So from there, one thing we can do in Nuix is we can actually visualize this process. So I'll just go here and go down in graph and select process graph. And what this shows is the WinZip and Afghan Air Force processes and the files that they created on the file system. So Afghan Air Force immediately dropped these 4 files onto my file system. And I'm showing a number of other items down here that are actually duplicates of the top here. And I can groom this or change it and move it around as necessary. But let's continue with our process exploration. And actually, this is an example of integrating threat intelligence into the platform that is new in 1.4 of adaptive security. Now, again, here we are looking at process events, but in this case, I'm assuming a different starting point to the investigation. So how would I find Afghan Air Force or a malicious process if I didn't have an alert telling me that it had violated a behavior rule? Maybe I got a call from a user saying that his machine is slow, or that she clicked on an attachment in an email and then it disappeared and she's concerned that something happened. So one way to look for that is by doing hash analysis. And what we've done here is we've compared all of the process events in a 24-hour period to a set of threat intelligence, of Nuix threat intelligence. And what that allows me to do is to compare all of my process data in this block of information to virus total. And the virus total results will indicate to me that whether there's known good, bad, or just unknown in the data set. And I can sort pretty easily by just grouping. Actually, this is a grouping action where I take a column header and group everything by virus total results. What that shows me is that I have a number of unknown events, I have a number of known good, and I have some known bads. And there's my Afghan Air Force process right there. And what that tells me is that I can take a threat intelligence approach to get to this starting point for my investigation. I don't necessarily have to have alerts in the alert pane. Now, from here, what we can do is dig down deeper into this threat. We can look at loaded modules because our agent is capturing all of the images, all of the DLLs that this particular that are loaded up on an endpoint. Again, a powerful way to look at this, and in this case, I've just filtered it down to the 2 processes that I know about that are of concern. And a powerful way to look at this is to use the grouping function again. So I've got my 2 processes, and then I'll group by image name, and that'll quickly show me the unique images that were loaded up by these processes. Now, what's a little unique about this is the combination of all of this data in a single pane of glass. So whereas with other combinations of tools, you might have to look across Windows event logs and logs from various other devices on the network. You might have to actually retrieve an image of the host. With adaptive security, you kind of have all of that in one place. And it's fairly easy to manipulate even large data sets as we're showing here. So in looking at images, one of the things that I might take a closer look at is the path that these images ran from. And just by sorting on the path, I can see that there are standard Windows paths that for the most part, the DLLs that these two processes called were running from. But by sorting on the path, I see that there's a number of temporary directories here that an additional set of images were running from. And there's a DLL actually that we hadn't discovered yet. This is another piece of threat intelligence that we could use to pivot. And with adaptive security, as I mentioned with the logic engine, we can pivot from a discovery like this into a behavior rule. And we can say blacklist this entire, we could blacklist this process immediately from our UI, which is a pretty powerful way to, again, make security more agile. We're trying to give security better weapons in the face of the threats that are evolving so quickly. So that's loaded modules. Files is something that the file information is going to be more relevant outside of a malware scenario. So certainly in this case, what we're showing is the files that have been created by this particular threat, these two particular threat processes, and I have 4 unique ones here. This file here is the main payload of this malware, and if I wanted to actually go in and delete this, that's an option. So I can actually go into the file system here and delete this from the target host. If this was an insider threat scenario, or if it was a scenario of attempting to monitor files, monitor sensitive information, since I have access to all of the file writes and renames and deletes across the file system, I'm going to see every time somebody saves or modifies a piece of sensitive data. And I can track that by MD5, I can track it by file name, and that's part of the power of collecting this data and providing insight in the way that the digital behavior recorder does. The next look that we have here is at the registry, and to analyze the registry, I've used a stored insight, a saved insight. And to do that, I'll just double click on registry persistence, and it's a saved query. This is a saved query that says, I know that there's 2 processes or 3 processes that you're concerned about, but I'm going to look at these specific keys in the registry for indicators of persistence, of malware trying to create keys that will allow it to run again after the endpoint is rebooted. And that's what this insight detects right here, is it shows that there's a registry set value by my malicious process to allow it to run, to persist itself on G4L17. Now, of course, all of my registry data is here. This is just a filter based on the run keys that I'm specifically interested in and concerned about. The next thing that we look at from a triage standpoint is namespace and network. And in this case, what I'm looking for is evidence of a unique namespace query. Now, I can get to that by starting by looking for processes that are making namespace queries. In this case, I've got 3: Outlook, Service Host, and WinZip. And if I look in Service Host here and sort this, group it by the thread ID, I can see that there's 2 standouts here. This one, in which case I have a call out to Microsoft, and another case in which I have an unusually high number of calls. And this is actually a malicious domain. This is associated with this remote access Trojan and is part of its behavior in reaching out to a command and control server. And we're able to identify that just with a couple of clicks by sorting and grouping based on process name and by thread ID. Moving on to network data, we have, again, the ability to look for things like a process identifier, 3572, which is the one that we know is associated with service host, and I want to see that this is any established network connections. And I can quickly get to my unique remote addresses here and see that this is the domain of interest. If I wanted to search on this particular domain and find this or do some additional digging on this, I can actually search RobTex or search Google for this particular IP address. And that just about wraps it up, everyone. Thank you for listening to me. I know it can be a bit tedious to go through this much tabular data, but hopefully what we've gotten across to you is the power that this places in the hands of security and the visibility that it gives them into the enterprise. So on the event timeline, what we've done here is consolidated all of these different event types into a single rolling timeline. And we can see where we started with a namespace query and then moved down into loaded modules and process events. And then file system events, I think we also have on this list. So hopefully that will give you a good sense of what we're able to do in adaptive security. And I think that's about all I had. Again, this is really about providing visibility and preventing breaches from happening in the first place. And hopefully it's clear the power of this kind of tool to support that and to enable you to answer the kinds of questions that are going to come up if a breach disclosure has to happen. And so with that, Keith, I'll turn it back over to you.
Hoke, thank you very much. And for those that are still online, we have had some questions that have been asked, and I neglected to say this ahead of time. If in fact you have questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll try to respond to them. And what I'd like to do now is start answering a couple of the questions in just the few minutes that we have left. The first question that we have is, what operating systems do you support? Hoke, I'll get you that.
Sure, Windows 7 and higher at the moment. Actually, Vista Service Pack 1 and higher. Various flavors of Windows Server, and Mac is on the roadmap by the end of this year. We're making good progress on the Mac agent. Linux is on tap for early next year.
Thank you very much. And I had another question that came in that perhaps this is targeted towards Harlan, and that is, why is there so much of the focus on endpoints? Harlan.
That's a good question, Keith. The reason there's so much focus on endpoints is because that's where the adversary resides. And I'm hesitant to say, I'm hesitant to draw a distinction between making it a possibility and an absolute. And the fact of the matter is, this is exactly where an adversary resides. When they break into an infrastructure, or they initiate their breach, it's through an endpoint. That endpoint may be on the perimeter, but it's still an endpoint nonetheless. Once they move laterally within the infrastructure, they're then connecting to further endpoints. Even when they move to file servers, that's still an endpoint. The crux of their activities, whether it's through remote access mechanisms such as terminal servers, or it's access to infrastructures via remote access Trojan that they've installed, all of the activity occurs on the endpoints. There are network communications that occur. A great deal of it has been more thoroughly encrypted over the last several years. As we saw from the demonstration, there are domain and host queries that are sent out to the internet, but the activity itself occurs on the endpoints. And that's why at Nuix, we're actually focused on the endpoint and monitoring those endpoints.
Thank you very much, Harlan. I think we have time for another question or two. I've got another one here. How do you keep your software from negatively impacting end users by slowing down their computers? Either Hoke or Harlan. Hoke, why don't you try that one first?
Sure. So we've been very careful to, it uses a kernel mode driver, so we've been very careful to keep it efficient. And generally we do that. We've just written a very efficient piece of code. The installer file is about 3 megabytes. It runs on about 20 megabytes of memory, and generally uses between 0.5% and 2% of CPU So it has a very light footprint on the endpoint.
Good. Harlan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that's a pretty thorough response from Hoke.
Well, great. I want to thank everyone that joined us today. Thanks to Harlan for participating, and thanks to Hoke. But more importantly, thanks to all of you that have joined us today. We hope that this has been of value to you, and that you have gained some insight into what we are trying to accomplish here at NUICS. We'd also like to kind of advertise and give you a save the date for our Thought Leadership Summit that's going to be held on March 8th in 2018. The focus of this year's is going to be practical approaches to manage risk in today's government. And I think you'll all be pleasantly happy and surprised by the quality of the speakers and the presentations that are given. With that, I will say goodbye to everyone, give you back about 4 minutes of your time. We appreciate you coming to our webinar today, and thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.